7 signs you are living someone else's life and never chose it. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that most people never choose the life they are living. They inherit it, the way a coat is inherited, worn without ever being tried on for fit, worn until the shoulders adjust to it, and the wearer forgets there was ever a choosing to be made. Jung was drawing on a line from Nietzsche that he returned to across decades of his own work. In The Joyful Wisdom, Nietzsche wrote, "You shall become the person you are," and Jung would stop a reader right there and ask you to notice the strangeness of it. Become, not simply be, as though there were a long and difficult labor standing between the person already alive underneath and the person who has been performing since childhood. And here is where Jung would press further. Most people hear that line as comfort, as permission. Discover yourself, express yourself. But Jung heard something colder and more exact, a warning that the self you are is not automatically the self you are living, that an entire life can be spent in the gap between the two, a gap so gradually filled in by other people's expectations that it comes to feel like your own skin. And that is the quiet ache beneath tonight's question, not whether your life looks wrong from the outside, but whether it was ever actually chosen by the one living it. So let me ask you to sit with this for just a moment before we go further. I notice the parts of my life that were handed to me, rather than chosen by me. I notice how much of my schedule, my ambitions, even my private sense of what a good life looks like, was written in a hand that was not mine, and I choose tonight to begin reading my own days for the first time, as though I had never read them before. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. And if this kind of quiet looking matters to you, consider staying close, subscribing so that tomorrow's teaching has a way of finding you again. And if somewhere in you just went still reading that, if some old familiar room in your life just got a little colder, type the 2 words, "face it," in the comments below. Not as a confession to anyone watching, just as a private seal you place on your own attention tonight. The first key is this, and the first sign is the one most people mistake for simple gratitude. You reach the milestone. The promotion arrives, the wedding is beautiful, the house closes, and something in you performs relief while something else in you stands perfectly still, untouched, almost bored by its own victory. Imagine a man who spent 11 years climbing toward a particular title, the sleepless projects, the moves to new cities for the sake of the ladder, the small sacrifices made almost without noticing them. And the evening he finally receives it, he drives home and cannot explain why the celebration feels like a party thrown for someone he is only pretending to be. He smiles for the photographs. He says all the correct sentences of gratitude, and underneath the sentences, there is only a strange, echoing quiet, as though he had climbed to the top of a mountain someone else had chosen for him, years before he was ever old enough to argue about the destination. Jung understood this as the difference between what the ego wants and what the self actually confirms. Because the ego can want a thing with total, aching sincerity and still be wanting it on instructions it never wrote itself. The wanting can feel completely real, completely yours, and still be running on a script, handed down before you had any language to refuse it. So pause for a moment right now and pick one real achievement from your own last 5 years. Something you were genuinely proud to tell people. Something you still mention at dinner tables when the conversation turns to your life. And ask honestly, whose applause was I actually collecting in that moment? A parent's, an old teacher's, a childhood rival you have not spoken to in 20 years. A version of yourself at 17 who was afraid of being seen as ordinary. This is not an accusation against your accomplishments. It is simply an audit of their authorship, because Jung wrote of individuation as a coming to selfhood, and coming implies you began somewhere else first, somewhere borrowed, somewhere built by hands that were not entirely your own. And the tell is never failure. Failure at least announces itself honestly. The tell is hollow success. The goal reached and the hunger completely unchanged, already reaching for the next borrowed peak because the last one never belonged to you enough to actually satisfy anything in you. Notice how quickly, after any real celebration fades, the mind is already drafting the next application, the next promotion, the next milestone to chase, as if satisfaction itself were the one thing perpetually out of reach. This is not ingratitude, and it is not a character flaw to be corrected through more discipline. It is quiet and exact information that the life receiving the congratulations is not fully the life being lived underneath it, and once you notice it in one trophy, you begin noticing the whole shelf, the diplomas, the titles, the carefully curated photographs, and the shelf, once you look honestly, is almost always longer than you first thought it was. Longer and quieter and stranger than you expected, standing there gathering a kind of dust that has nothing to do with time. I let my own quiet tell me the truth my applause could not. The second key is this, and the second sign is subtler than the first because it does not announce itself with hollowness. It announces itself with obedience. You look at your own calendar, your own 5-year plan, your own quiet private assumptions about what a life is supposed to contain by a certain age, and you realize the whole shape of it was drawn before you had any capacity to argue with the drawing. Jung called this living according to the morning program of life, the set of instructions absorbed so early, from family, from culture, from a particular household's version of what counts as safety and success, that by the time you were old enough to question them, you had already built your identity on top of them, like a house built on someone else's foundation. Imagine a woman who was told, gently but constantly, from about the age of 7, that she was the responsible one, the reasonable one, the one who did not need looking after because she could always look after herself. And imagine how quietly that description became a career, became a marriage, became a whole personality organized entirely around never being any trouble to anyone. 30 years later, she cannot explain why she resents being reliable, only that she does. And Jung would say she is not ungrateful. She is simply still running a description handed to her. Before she had any language to refuse it, the description became the plan, and the plan became the life. And nobody along the way ever actually asked her what she wanted the shape of her days to be. And Jung wrote plainly that what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie, meaning the program that got you through your 20s, achieve, prove, secure, please, was never meant to run unchanged for an entire life. It was scaffolding, useful, and even necessary for a season. But scaffolding is not architecture, and too many people spend their whole lives polishing scaffolding, mistaking it for the building itself. Imagine someone who chose a whole career at 19 because it pleased a father who has been gone for a decade now, and still, every difficult decision in that life gets quietly measured against a dead man's approval. This is not weakness, Jung would say. It is simply the morning program still running long after morning has ended. And notice how this shows itself in small, ordinary ways, long before it shows itself in large ones. The vacation chosen because it photographs well, rather than because it rests you. The second child arriving on a timeline set by other people's assumptions about family, rather than by any private readiness. The hobby abandoned quietly because it never produced anything measurable. None of these are crimes. They are simply evidence. Small, consistent evidence that a program is still running underneath decisions that feel, on the surface, entirely free. And here is the plain test. Ask yourself honestly whether the ambitions you are chasing right now would survive being separated entirely from whoever taught them to you. Would you still want this if the person who first made it look desirable had never existed? If the answer catches in your throat, even slightly, you have found a program running, not a preference chosen. And Jung's word for the correction was not rebellion, it was individuation, becoming individual, literally undivided, no longer split between the self underneath and the instructions on top. I stop running a program I never wrote and call it a plan. The third key is this, and the third sign is the one you can actually catch in real time if you are willing to look at one ordinary day closely enough. So let us walk through it together, slowly, the way Jung himself would have insisted on slowness, because insight into this particular sign never arrives through a single dramatic realization. It arrives through patient, almost tedious observation of the small hours. So imagine a perfectly unremarkable Tuesday. The alarm sounds at an hour set not by your own body's rhythm, but by a job whose demands were never actually negotiated, only accepted. 7 in the morning, and already the first decision of the day, what to wear, is being made by an internal committee of other people's eyes. What will look competent? What will not embarrass? What would a certain colleague think? By 8, you are answering messages before you have even had a private thought of your own. The outside world arriving into your attention before your own mind has had a chance to arrive there first. By 9, you are at a desk performing a version of diligence that was modeled for you by a boss you privately do not respect, but have never stopped imitating. By noon, lunch is decided not by hunger, but by what a lunch is supposed to look like among people you are quietly trying to impress. By 2, a small ache arrives in the body, tiredness, and it is immediately overridden because rest was never scheduled into this particular program. By 3 in the afternoon, a small flicker of an idea arrives. A genuine private desire, maybe to leave early and sit by water somewhere, and it is dismissed within 4 seconds by an inner voice that sounds suspiciously like someone from childhood explaining why that would be irresponsible. By 5, there is a brief window, 10 unclaimed minutes, and notice what fills them. Not stillness, but a reflex reach for a screen, because an empty 10 minutes with nothing assigned to it can feel, to a life built entirely on assignment, almost unbearable. By 6, you arrive home and collapse in front of a screen, not because you actually want the content, but because it is the only permission structure you have built for rest. And by 11, you fall asleep having made perhaps 3 decisions all day that were actually your own. Now hold that same Tuesday up beside a different kind of day, a rarer one, perhaps a Sunday morning once or twice a year when nothing was owed to anyone, and notice how differently even fatigue feels at the end of it. Tired from a day you authored feels like weight earned. Tired from a day you inherited feels like weight borrowed. The body can tell the difference even when the mind has stopped noticing. And here is what Jung would want you to see plainly. None of the ordinary Tuesday required a villain. No one forced this day on you at gunpoint, and that is exactly the mechanism he was pointing toward. The borrowed life does not arrive through force. It arrives through 1,000 small, unexamined permissions, granted so early and so quietly that by adulthood they no longer feel like permissions at all. They feel like personality. And a decade is simply 3,650 such Tuesdays stacked one on top of the other, each one small, each one forgivable, until the stack itself becomes indistinguishable from a life. So here is the exercise. Pause for a moment and take one real day from your own last week, not an exceptional day, an ordinary one, and go through it hour by hour the way we just did. And for each decision, ask simply, was that mine or was that inherited? You do not need to change anything yet. You only need to see clearly, because Jung insisted that seeing precedes any real change. The unconscious pattern only loses its grip once it is dragged into daylight and looked at directly. And most people never do this single exercise even once in an entire lifetime. They simply live inside the pattern the way a fish lives inside water, unaware there is any other medium available. So try it honestly this week, one ordinary day, mapped hour by hour, and notice how many of the day's decisions were actually authored by you. I look at one ordinary day and ask honestly whose voice was running it. The 4th key is this, and the 4th sign is the flinch, the very specific, very physical flinch that arrives when someone who loves you asks a deceptively simple question. What do you actually want? Not what should you want, not what would be sensible, not what would make everyone comfortable, but what do you, specifically and only you, actually want? And notice what happens in your body before your mind even produces an answer. For many people, there is a small cold drop in the stomach, a stalling, an almost panicked reach for a socially acceptable answer that arrives suspiciously fast and suspiciously smooth. Jung would say that speed and smoothness are themselves the evidence. A question that touches something genuinely your own tends to produce hesitation first. A real want has weight. It has to be located, whereas a borrowed want has been rehearsed so many times, it launches instantly, fully formed. indistinguishable from truth, until you notice how little friction it produced on the way out. Imagine someone asked at a dinner table what they would do with a completely free year, and the answer arrives instantly. Travel, of course. And yet if you gently pressed further, where, doing what, with whom, the whole structure dissolves into vagueness. Because it was never a real want, it was simply the answer that sounds correct at dinner tables. And imagine a second scene, quieter, a person standing in their own kitchen on the morning of their birthday, and a spouse asks kindly, "What would you actually like this year?" And the answer comes out before the question has even finished landing, "Oh, anything. Surprise me." And notice how that answer costs nothing, requires nothing, risks nothing. It is not generosity, Jung would say. It is a well-worn groove, worn smooth by a childhood, in which asking for something specific was met with correction, or disappointment, or simply too much attention. So the safest want became no want at all, dressed up as ease. This is not a small thing. Jung considered the capacity to answer that question honestly one of the clearest measures of how much of a life actually belongs to the person living it. And he would ask you to notice a further layer, that the instant answer is rarely a lie exactly. It is something quieter and sadder than a lie. It is a substitute grown so familiar it has forgotten it is a substitute, standing in for a want that was never given room enough to form its own shape. So here is the small test to carry with you. The next time that question lands, whether from another person or from your own quiet mind late at night, resist the urge to answer immediately. Let the silence sit for longer than is comfortable, past the point where it starts to feel strange, and watch what surfaces once the rehearsed answers run out of momentum. That residue, uncomfortable and unpolished as it may be, is closer to the truth than anything that arrived instantly. Pause for a moment right now and pick one real question you were asked recently. What do you want for dinner? What do you want to do this weekend? And notice honestly whether your answer came from a genuine appetite or from a script running faster than your own wanting could catch up to it. I let the honest answer arrive late, rather than the rehearsed one arrive fast. Before we go further, if this kind of honest looking is rare for you elsewhere, let this be one place you keep returning to. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it keeps tomorrow's teaching within reach. The fifth key is this, and it holds two signs together, because they are really one deeper sign wearing two faces. So let us take this slowly, in pieces, the way it actually happened in Jung's own life. First, consider the collapse itself. Jung recalled that at 38 years old, already an accomplished psychiatrist with a thriving practice, a marriage, a reputation, a life that from the outside looked entirely arrived at, he found himself gripped by a disorientation so severe he doubted his own sanity. The achievements were real, the credentials were real, and yet none of it, he wrote later, felt like it belonged to him anymore. He described feeling as though the ground beneath a carefully built professional identity had simply given way. And here is the fifth sign hiding inside that collapse. The sign is this, a growing suspicion, faint at first and then impossible to ignore, that the life you built so competently was built primarily to satisfy a version of success that was never actually yours to begin with. Jung had built exactly what a brilliant young psychiatrist in his position was supposed to build. And it was precisely that correctness, that fit with everyone else's expectations, which had quietly hollowed the thing out from within. Second, consider how ordinary this pattern actually is, once you stop imagining it belongs only to famous men in old memoirs. Imagine a woman who spent 20 years building a design firm from nothing, who can point to the building with her name on the door, who has every external proof a life could ask for, and who still finds herself sitting in her car in the parking lot some evenings, engine off, simply unable to go inside and start the day. Not depressed exactly, not in crisis exactly, just quietly unconvinced that any of it is actually hers. She would tell you the firm is a success, and she would be telling the truth, and she would also be describing, without knowing the word for it, exactly what Jung meant by a life correctly built and privately hollow. This is the pattern repeating itself in ordinary rooms, in ordinary cars, In ordinary Sunday evenings before an ordinary Monday, it does not require fame or a psychiatric collapse to qualify. It only requires a life whose blueprint was approved by everyone except the one living inside it. Third, consider what Jung did not do in response to his own version of this. He did not simply abandon the practice, the marriage, the reputation. He did not burn the life down and declare himself free, because Jung understood something the popular imagination since has largely gotten wrong. This was not a midlife crisis in the modern sense. That particular phrase, and its dramatic connotations, belonged to a later writer, Elliot Jakes, coining the term decades afterward, and the popular claim that life begins at 40 belongs to an author named Walter Pitkin, not to Jung at all. Jung's own language was quieter and far more demanding. He called it individuation, a slow, deliberate coming to selfhood that required what he named considerable moral effort, not a dramatic exit from one's life, but a patient, unglamorous excavation underneath it. He sat with his own disorientation for years, recording dreams, engaging images that rose unbidden from within, refusing to either dismiss the collapse as madness or romanticize it as revelation. Fourth, consider the sign folded inside that same period, the sign of the return that never quite lands. You accomplish the thing, you arrive at the place you were told would feel like home, and instead of arrival, you feel a strange, persistent sense of still being on the way somewhere else, a homesickness with no destination attached to it. Jung wrote that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. And this line matters enormously here, because it means the very success that once fit you can become, without any wrongdoing on your part, the wrong shape entirely, not because you failed, but because you grew, and the shape did not grow with you. Think of a coat bought honestly, fitted correctly, worn faithfully for years, and then one day simply too small in the shoulders. No one would call that a failure of the coat. They would call it what it is, a body that kept living past the size it was measured for. Fifth, notice that this homesickness rarely announces itself loudly. It tends to arrive in small domestic moments, standing in a kitchen that is exactly the kitchen you once dreamed of owning, and feeling, instead of contentment, a kind of static, a low hum of not quite, walking through an office you fought for years to earn a corner in, and feeling the corner itself has nothing to say to you. These are not ungrateful feelings. Jung would insist on that point. They are diagnostic ones. They are the unlived life, patient and unhurried, finally beginning to knock on a door that success was supposed to have locked for good. And now, gently, let the lens turn toward you, rather than toward Jung, or toward any composite figure in a story. Because this is the moment in the teaching where it stops being about other people's borrowed lives and starts being about yours. Ask yourself plainly, where in my own life have I mistaken correctness for aliveness? Where have I built something that satisfies every reasonable external measure and still leaves me faintly homesick in the evenings? This is not failure, and it is certainly not madness. Jung was firm that this disorientation, however frightening, is not a symptom to be cured, but a summons to be answered. The unlived portions of a life do not simply vanish because they were never chosen. They wait, patiently, and eventually they knock, sometimes through restlessness, sometimes through a collapse like Jung's own, sometimes through nothing more dramatic than sitting in a parked car unable to go inside, or a Tuesday evening spent staring at a life that technically has everything and still feels, somehow, borrowed. The moral effort Jung asked for is not the effort of achieving more, it is the harder effort of sitting still long enough with your own disorientation to let it tell you what it actually wants, rather than immediately smothering it with another borrowed ambition. I stop mistaking correctness for aliveness and sit with what is actually mine. The sixth key is this, and the seventh and final sign is, unexpectedly, a relief rather than an ache. Notice the moments, rare as they may be, when you do something no one assigned you, something with no audience calculated into it, no resume line imagined, no parent's ghost consulted, and afterward, There is a small, clean, unfamiliar quiet. Not excitement exactly. Something steadier than that. Imagine spending an entire unplanned afternoon repairing an old piece of furniture for no reason anyone asked, or walking a route with no destination, or writing something you have no intention of showing to a single other person, and noticing afterward that you feel, oddly, more like yourself than you did at the height of any applauded achievement. Jung would say, this feeling is not incidental, it is a genuine signal from the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, that a Nietzsche would have called becoming the person you already are. And here is what makes this sign so easy to miss. It rarely arrives wearing a crown. It does not announce itself the way a promotion does, or a wedding, or a diploma handed across a stage while people clap on cue. It arrives instead as something almost embarrassingly small. Imagine a woman who spends a Saturday morning teaching herself to identify birds by their calls alone. No one asked her to. It will not appear on any account of her life that anyone else will ever read. And yet she notices, walking home, that she feels more oriented inside her own body than she did the entire week of meetings that everyone praised her for handling so well. That is the sign, quiet, undramatic, almost apologetic, in how little it asks to be noticed. And this is exactly why Jung insisted that individuation is not a single dramatic reckoning, but a long attentiveness practiced in small rooms. Because the borrowed life is loud, it has calendars and titles and other people's applause to keep it fed, while the chosen life often first appears no louder than a single lantern left burning in a room everyone else has already left. Easy to walk past, easy to blow out without noticing. And so the practice is not to demand a revelation, but to protect that lantern. To notice, this week, one moment where you act without calculating anyone else's verdict, and to sit for a moment afterward with the specific quality of feeling that follows. Is it flatter than the applause you are used to? Or is it, somehow, more solid, more yours? Ask that honestly, and let the answer accumulate over days rather than arriving all at once. Because Jung never promised a single afternoon of furniture repair would undo a lifetime of borrowed program. What he promised was something slower and more trustworthy. That the feeling itself, followed patiently and repeated, is how a borrowed life is gradually, unglamorously, exchanged for a chosen one, not through demolition, but through attention, paid again and again to the smallest, quietest evidence of what was always trying to come through. I notice what feels mine, and I let that feeling teach me. Here is the whole picture. Hollow applause reveals a borrowed goal. An inherited schedule reveals a program never questioned. One ordinary Tuesday mapped hour by hour reveals whose voice actually runs your day. A flinch at the question of your own wanting reveals how rehearsed your answers have become. A disorientation like Jung's own at 38 reveals that correctness and aliveness are not the same thing. And a quiet relief in an unassigned hour reveals what was always trying to come through. And here is the recognition, sitting underneath all 7 signs at once. They were never 7 separate discoveries. They were 7 angles on a single question, asked over and over in different rooms of your life. Whose life is this actually? And the mercy in that question, however unsettling it first feels, is that it can be asked at any age, in any circumstance, starting from wherever you happen to be standing tonight. None of this requires you to indict your entire past. Jung was clear that the morning program is not a mistake to be ashamed of. It was simply the scaffolding available to you at a time when you had no other way to stand. The invitation now is only to notice where the scaffolding has outlived the building it was meant to support, and to let that noticing be gradual, patient, and honest rather than dramatic. This is the quieter, harder work Jung called individuation, not a single revelation, but a long attentiveness, practiced one ordinary day, one honest answer, one unassigned afternoon at a time. So carry this with you past tonight, the same 3-part attentiveness we began with, noticing what was handed to you rather than chosen, noticing the voices still running your calendar, and turning that noticing, gradually, into something that finally belongs to you, This is the whole of what individuation asks. And if you find yourself tonight standing in a life that looks, from the outside, entirely arrived at, and still feels somehow like it belongs to someone else, ask yourself gently, as Jung would have asked, whose life have I actually been living, and would I recognize my own? If it finally knocked,